In Auschwitz, among the yellow stars of Jews, the red triangles of political prisoners, and the pink triangles of homosexuals, there was one group that bewildered even the SS guards themselves. They wore purple triangles, and unlike every other prisoner in that hell, they could have walked out the gates at any moment. All they had to do was sign a single document renouncing their faith. Most never did. These were the Jehovah's Witnesses, and their story is one of the most disturbing and least known chapters of the Holocaust. While historians have documented the 6 million Jews murdered and the millions of others who perished, the tale of these religious prisoners remains hidden in the shadows of history, perhaps because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when absolute faith collides with absolute evil? The year was 1933, and Adolf Hitler had just seized power in Germany. While most religious organizations either supported the Nazi regime or remained silent, one small group refused to salute, refused to say Heil Hitler, and refused to serve in the military. The Jehovah's Witnesses, known in Germany as Bibelforscher or Bible students, believed that their loyalty belonged only to God's kingdom, not to any earthly government. This was not a political stance. It was theological. They distributed their magazines, held their meetings, and continued preaching even as the Gestapo began arresting them by the hundreds. By 1935, they were banned throughout the Reich. By 1939, they were being shipped to concentration camps, in numbers that would eventually reach over 12,000. What made these prisoners unique was not just their purple triangle badge, but the strange respect and fear they generated within the camp system. The SS quickly realized that Jehovah's Witnesses would not lie, would not steal, and would not attempt escape. They were reliable, hard-working, and completely trustworthy in the most bizarre way imaginable. Soon they were given jobs that other prisoners could only dream of, working in SS homes as servants, caring for Nazi children, handling food supplies, and even serving as barbers who held razors to the throats of their captors each morning. The irony was suffocating. Here were people who could be trusted with anything except obedience to the Reich itself. But this strange trust came with a darker side. The Nazis saw an opportunity. If these people were so faithful to their beliefs, perhaps they could be broken in ways that other prisoners could not. Perhaps their faith itself could become the instrument of their torture. Camp commanders developed a specific strategy: offer them freedom in exchange for a signature. Just one signature on a document renouncing their faith and pledging loyalty to Hitler. Some signed immediately, most did not. And for those who refused, Auschwitz had special plans. The purple triangles were about to face a test of faith that would make martyrdom look merciful. Because the Nazis had discovered something terrifying, the best way to break someone who believes in absolute truth is not to kill them quickly, but to force them to watch as their faith destroys everything and everyone they love. This is the story they never taught you in school, the story of the prisoners who could have left, but chose to stay, and the unimaginable price they paid for that choice. To understand why the Jehovah's Witnesses became targets of such intense Nazi hatred, we need to go back to the early 1930s, when Hitler's grip on Germany was still tightening. The Witnesses were not a large group, numbering only about 25,000 in Germany at the time, but they were visible, organized, and utterly uncompromising. While the Catholic Church signed a concordat with Hitler in 1933, and most Protestant churches fell in line with the regime, the Witnesses did something that enraged the Nazis beyond measure. They said no, not quietly, not privately, but publicly and repeatedly. They refused to give the Hitler salute, which they considered idolatry. They refused to join the Nazi Party or any of its organizations. Most critically, they refused military service, viewing it as a violation of God's commandment not to kill. The Nazi response was swift and brutal. On April 1, 1935, the Gestapo banned all Jehovah's Witness activities throughout Germany. Kingdom halls were raided and closed. Literature was confiscated and burned. Witnesses lost their jobs, their pensions, their businesses. Children were taken from parents deemed unfit for refusing to teach Nazi ideology. But the crackdown had an unexpected effect. It made the Witnesses more determined. They went underground, printing and distributing their magazines in secret, holding meetings in forests and basements, and continuing to preach door to door despite the danger. To the Nazi mind, this was not just defiance, it was a direct challenge to the totalitarian state itself. If one group could refuse and survive, others might follow. The witnesses had to be crushed completely. By 1939, when World War II erupted, the deportations to concentration camps accelerated dramatically. Dachau received the first large groups, followed by Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and eventually Auschwitz. The witnesses were classified as political prisoners, but they were marked differently from communists or socialists. They received the purple triangle, a color chosen deliberately to set them apart. Unlike political prisoners who might be released after renouncing their beliefs or serving their time, the witnesses were given a unique option that appeared almost generous. Sign a declaration renouncing your faith, pledge loyalty to Hitler, and agree to military service, and you walk free today. The document was called the Verpflichtungserklärung, a declaration of commitment to the state. This document became the defining feature of the witness experience in the camps. It was offered repeatedly, sometimes daily. Guards would wave it in their faces during roll call. Commandants would call them into offices and present it with calm logic. Why suffer when freedom is one signature away? Your family needs you. Your children are alone. God would understand. Sign it. Just sign it. The psychological warfare was deliberate and sophisticated. The Nazis understood that breaking these prisoners was not about physical torture alone. It was about forcing them to choose between their earthly lives and their heavenly hope, between the people they loved and the God they worshipped. Most chose God, and that choice transformed Auschwitz into something even darker for the purple triangles. Because the Nazis realized that if these people would not save themselves, perhaps they could be used to destroy each other. The camp system was about to discover that the most faithful prisoners could become the most useful tools, and that trust in the hands of evil becomes the sharpest weapon of all. The real nightmare was just beginning. When the first Jehovah's Witnesses arrived at Auschwitz in 1940, the SS guards expected them to be like every other prisoner, broken, desperate, willing to do anything to survive another day. What they found instead was something that defied all logic of the camp system. These prisoners did not fight over food. They did not steal from each other. They shared what little they had. They refused to lie even when lying would save their lives. They kept their barracks cleaner than any other group. They sang hymns quietly at night, despite the risk of punishment. And most bewildering of all, they seemed to possess an inner peace that the guards themselves could not understand. This was not the behavior of defeated people. This was something else entirely, and it both fascinated and infuriated the Nazis in equal measure. The SS quickly recognized an opportunity that other camps had already exploited. If these people could be trusted completely in everything except obedience to Hitler, why not use them? Within months, purple triangles were being assigned to positions that required absolute reliability. They worked as housekeepers in the homes of SS officers, where they had access to food, valuables, and weapons, but never stole a crumb. They were given jobs in the camp kitchens, handling supplies that could easily be smuggled or sabotaged, but they never took advantage. Some were made personal servants to high-ranking Nazis, shaving their faces each morning with straight razors, close enough to kill but never even contemplating it. The most surreal assignment came when witness women were brought to the homes of SS families to care for Nazi children, trusted to raise the sons and daughters of the very people who imprisoned them. This created a strange paradox within Auschwitz itself. The purple triangles had become the most privileged prisoners in certain ways, yet they remained the most vulnerable in others. Their reliability earned them better food, lighter work, and occasional protection from the random violence that defined camp life. Other prisoners noticed this, and the resentment was palpable. Some accused the witnesses of collaboration, of being Nazi sympathizers who had cut secret deals. The truth was far more complex and far more disturbing. The witnesses were not collaborators. They were hostages to their own integrity. Their faith demanded honesty, hard work, and obedience to authority in all matters except worship. So they obeyed camp rules meticulously, worked efficiently, and served their captors faithfully, all while refusing the one thing that mattered most: their signature on that document. The Nazis began to experiment with this paradox in increasingly cruel ways. They would place witnesses in positions of minor authority over other prisoners, testing whether power would corrupt them as it corrupted others. It rarely did. They would deliberately create situations where a witness could escape if they chose to, then watch as they remained bound by their belief that God, not man, would determine when their suffering ended. Some guards found this amusing. Others found it deeply unsettling. How do you control people who fear something greater than death itself? How do you break someone who has already surrendered their will to a power you cannot touch? But the SS were nothing if not creative in their cruelty. If the witnesses would not break under traditional torture, if offers of freedom would not work, then perhaps a different approach was needed. Perhaps the key was not to threaten what they loved on earth, but to force them to betray what they loved in heaven. The real torture was about to begin, and it would use their faith itself as the whip. The psychological torture began subtly at first, then escalated into something far more sinister than physical beatings could ever achieve. Camp commandants discovered that the witnesses had a weakness that other prisoners did not. Their absolute commitment to biblical principles made them predictable, and predictability could be weaponized. The first test came in the form of Sabbath violations. The witnesses believed that certain days and certain acts were sacred, and the SS began forcing them to perform tasks specifically designed to violate their conscience. They were ordered to work on religious meeting days, forced to handle Christmas decorations for Nazi celebrations, and commanded to participate in activities they considered idolatrous. Refusal meant beatings, starvation, or solitary confinement in the standing cells, where prisoners could neither sit nor lie down for days. But even this did not break them as expected. The witnesses absorbed the punishment with the same quiet determination that had brought them to Auschwitz in the first place. So the Nazis escalated to a far more diabolical strategy. They began targeting the families of witnesses still free in Germany. The Gestapo maintained detailed records of every witness in the camps, including the names and locations of their spouses, children, parents, and siblings. Guards would summon a purple triangle prisoner and calmly explain that their wife had been arrested and sent to Ravensbrück, the women's camp. Their children had been placed in Nazi orphanages where they would be raised as good Germans, taught to worship Hitler and forget Jehovah entirely. The solution was simple and immediate. Sign the document, renounce your faith, and your family would be released within days. Some prisoners were even shown photographs of their children in Nazi youth uniforms, letters forged in their handwriting, begging their parents to come home. The camps had become theaters of emotional warfare, where love itself was turned into an instrument of torture. This is where the true cost of faith became visible in ways that statistics and history books can never fully capture. Every purple triangle in Auschwitz faced this impossible choice repeatedly, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly. They could hear the screams from the medical experimentation blocks. They could smell the smoke from the crematoria. They knew exactly what happened to people who stayed in this place too long. And yet they also believed with absolute certainty that signing that document meant eternal death, while physical death in the camp meant eternal life in God's kingdom. The mathematics of martyrdom are simple when you believe infinity is at stake, but the human cost was devastating. Witnesses watched each other waste away, knowing that one signature could save them all. They received letters from their children that broke their hearts. They learned of family members dying in other camps alone and afraid because they too had refused to sign. The SS officers conducting these psychological operations kept detailed notes on which approaches worked best to break the witnesses. They discovered that threatening the prisoners themselves was largely ineffective, but threatening their children produced visible anguish, even if it rarely produced signatures. They learned that showing photographs was more effective than verbal descriptions. They found that female witnesses broke slightly more often than males when confronted with evidence of their children's suffering, though both genders showed extraordinary resistance compared to any other prisoner category. These findings were shared between camps, refined, and implemented with the cold efficiency that characterized all Nazi operations. The goal was not just to obtain signatures, but to prove that faith itself was a delusion, that could be shattered with sufficient pressure. Yet despite all of this, the vast majority of purple triangles never signed. Historical records suggest that fewer than 10% of Jehovah's Witnesses in the entire camp system renounced their faith, a resistance rate unmatched by any other group. This reality drove some Nazi officials to genuine confusion and others to rage. How could these people, most of them ordinary Germans with no special training or education, withstand pressures that broke hardened political prisoners and trained soldiers? The answer lay in something the Nazis fundamentally could not comprehend. These prisoners had already made their choice before they ever arrived at Auschwitz, and no amount of earthly suffering could unmake a decision they believed was cosmic in scope. The daily reality of life as a purple triangle in Auschwitz existed in a strange twilight zone between privilege and persecution that made their experience unlike any other prisoner group. While they faced the same starvation rations, the same disease-ridden barracks, and the same ever-present threat of death that haunted everyone in the camp, their refusal to compromise created a bizarre social dynamic that set them apart. Other prisoners watched with a mixture of admiration and resentment, as witnesses received slightly better treatment due to their trustworthiness, yet also witnessed the unique psychological torments inflicted upon them. The purple triangles were simultaneously the most reliable workers in the camp and the most stubborn obstacles to Nazi authority. This contradiction created a daily existence that oscillated between moments of relative safety and episodes of targeted cruelty, designed specifically to break their faith rather than their bodies. The work assignments given to witnesses revealed the full complexity of their situation within the camp hierarchy. Because they could be trusted not to poison food, many worked in the SS kitchens, where they prepared meals for guards while their fellow prisoners starved mere meters away. Because they would not attempt escape, some were allowed outside the camp perimeter to work on SS farms and estates with minimal supervision. Because they demonstrated obsessive cleanliness even in the filth of Auschwitz, they were often assigned to maintain SS quarters and administrative buildings. These positions came with access to extra food scraps, warmer clothing, and protection from the random violence of capos and guards who brutalized other prisoners for entertainment. But this privileged status came with a price that extended far beyond the obvious moral anguish of serving their oppressors. It created isolation from other prisoner groups who saw them as collaborators, and it made their continued refusal to sign the declaration document even more incomprehensible to the Nazis, who could not understand why anyone would choose suffering over the comfort being offered. The internal life of the witness community within Auschwitz became a secret world of whispered prayers, clandestine Bible study, and mutual support that sustained them through horrors that destroyed others. They developed coded language to discuss scripture during work details, hiding biblical discussions behind seemingly mundane conversations about farming or cooking. They shared food with meticulous fairness, dividing even the smallest crumb equally among their group, regardless of who had obtained it. When one witness died, others would quietly memorize details of their life to share with surviving family members if any of them ever made it out alive. They sang hymns in harmony so quietly that only those pressed close together in their bunks could hear, creating moments of worship in a place designed to extinguish all hope and humanity. This underground spiritual community became their true sustenance, more vital than the watery soup and moldy bread that kept their bodies technically alive. But the Nazis were always watching, always probing for weaknesses, and they began to understand that the witness community itself might be the key to breaking individual faith. A new and even more cruel strategy emerged, forcing witnesses to participate in the punishment of other witnesses. Guards would select a purple triangle and order them to beat a fellow believer who had been caught praying or possessing contraband scripture. Refusal meant both prisoners would be beaten far worse, possibly killed. Compliance meant violating the biblical command to love your brother, becoming complicit in the very system they had sacrificed everything to resist. Some witnesses, faced with this impossible choice, would strike their brothers as gently as possible while begging forgiveness. Others refused entirely and accepted the consequences. The guards watched these scenes with fascination, taking notes on how far faith could be bent, before it finally snapped under the weight of moral impossibility. Through it all, The document remained. The Verpflichtungserklärung sat in filing cabinets in the camp administrative offices, one for each purple triangle, waiting for a signature that would mean freedom. Some witnesses reported that they could feel its presence like a physical weight, a constant temptation whispering that all of this suffering was unnecessary and self-imposed. Guards would mention it casually during work details, reminding them that unlike the Jews who had no escape, unlike the political prisoners who had committed actual crimes against the Reich, they alone could leave whenever they chose. The psychological pressure was unrelenting and multifaceted, designed to attack faith from every possible angle until something finally gave way. Yet for most, nothing did. Their resistance was entering its most dangerous phase because the Nazis were running out of patience and beginning to consider more permanent solutions. By 1942, Auschwitz had evolved from a political prison into the epicenter of the Holocaust's machinery of death, and the purple triangles found themselves caught in an increasingly lethal environment. The camp's expansion brought new crematoria, new gas chambers, and an industrial approach to murder that processed thousands of victims daily. Jewish prisoners arrived by the trainload, were selected on the ramp, and vanished into the gas chambers within hours of their arrival. Political prisoners were worked to death in the surrounding labor camps. Soviet prisoners of war were shot by the thousands in execution yards. In this landscape of mechanized genocide, the witnesses remained a puzzle that irritated Nazi officials, precisely because they did not fit into any existing category of elimination. They were not racial enemies to be exterminated, not military threats to be executed, and not political opponents to be tortured for information. They were ordinary Germans whose only crime was refusing to worship the state, and their continued existence represented an ideological problem that brute force alone could not solve. The arrival of Dr. Joseph Mengele and other SS doctors in 1943 brought a new dimension of horror to Auschwitz, and the witnesses were not exempt from their attention. Mengele's twin experiments are well documented, but less known are his interests in testing the limits of human faith and psychological endurance. Purple triangles were sometimes selected for medical experiments specifically designed to explore the relationship between belief and survival. Some were subjected to extreme cold water immersion while being told they would be released if they signed the document before losing consciousness. Others were given hallucinogenic drugs and observed to see if altered mental states would weaken their religious convictions. A few were placed in sensory deprivation chambers for days and then offered the declaration as their first human contact upon release. These experiments were not random cruelty, but deliberate scientific inquiry into the nature of faith itself, conducted with the same cold methodology that Mengele applied to his genetic research. The results consistently frustrated the researchers. Even under extreme physical and psychological stress, the witnesses maintained their refusal to sign at rates that the SS doctors found statistically inexplicable. The most devastating test came in the form of what camp survivors later called the Parade of the Children. In isolated incidents documented by multiple sources, SS officers arranged for the children of imprisoned witnesses to be brought to Auschwitz and paraded past their parents during roll call. These children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, had been taken from orphanages and foster homes where they had been placed after their parents' arrests. They were cleaned, dressed in proper clothing, and made to look healthy and cared for. The parents, standing in their striped uniforms, skeletal from starvation and disease, were allowed to see their children but not speak to them. The children often did not recognize their own parents, having been told they were dead, or having forgotten them entirely after years of separation. Then the offer was made publicly: sign the document now, and you go home with your child today. The child will have their parent back, and you will have your freedom. Refuse, and the child returns to the orphanage, perhaps never to be seen again. Historical accounts suggest that even this tactic, the most emotionally brutal psychological warfare the Nazis devised, produced only a handful of signatures. Most parents stood silent, tears streaming down their faces, and watched their children be led away. The reaction of other prisoners to these scenes revealed the complex social dynamics within Auschwitz itself. Some viewed the witnesses with contempt, seeing their refusal to sign as selfish fanaticism that prioritized abstract beliefs over concrete human suffering. Jewish prisoners, who had no option of release regardless of what they signed, sometimes expressed bitter resentment toward people who could walk free but chose not to. Political prisoners, many of whom had compromised their own principles to survive, found the witness commitment both inspiring and infuriating. Yet others, particularly those who had witnessed the most profound horrors of the camp, began to see the purple triangles as proof that human dignity could survive even in Auschwitz. Their refusal to be broken represented something important in a place designed to prove that everything could be broken. They became living arguments against the Nazi worldview, demonstrations that the human spirit contained elements that no amount of force could completely extinguish. The SS response to this continued resistance evolved from frustration to a kind of grudging curiosity to finally, a decision that if the witnesses could not be broken, perhaps they could simply be eliminated. By 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, and the camp system began its final, most murderous phase, orders came down to reduce the special privileges afforded to purple triangles. Witnesses lost their positions in SS households and kitchens. They were reassigned to the hardest labor details: hauling stones, digging drainage ditches in frozen ground, working in the crematorium Sonderkommando units. The message was clear. If they would not renounce their faith voluntarily, they would be worked to death like everyone else. The document would still be offered, but patience had run out. Sign or die slowly became sign or die quickly. Yet even as the net tightened, even as their bodies weakened and their numbers dwindled, the purple triangles maintained their community and their faith. They continued to share food, to sing quiet hymns, to memorize scriptures together in the shadows of the barracks. They whispered encouragement to those whose faith wavered, reminding each other that their suffering was temporary, but their reward would be eternal. They had entered Auschwitz believing that God was testing them, and nothing they had experienced had shaken that fundamental conviction. The camp had thrown everything at them: starvation, disease, torture, psychological warfare, the weaponization of their own love for their families, and still they stood. The climax of their story was approaching, and it would reveal both the absolute limits of human endurance and the terrible cost of unwavering faith in the face of absolute evil. The winter of 1944 brought Auschwitz to its darkest hour, and for the purple triangles, it marked the beginning of the end. The Nazi war machine was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and the camp authorities received orders to accelerate the extermination process and destroy evidence of their crimes. The gas chambers worked around the clock, processing Hungarian Jews who arrived in numbers so vast that the crematoria could not keep pace, forcing the SS to burn bodies in open pits that turned the sky orange at night. In this apocalyptic atmosphere, the continued existence of the witnesses became an administrative irritation that the SS decided to resolve with finality. New orders circulated. Purple triangles were to be given one last opportunity to sign the declaration, and those who refused would be sent to the hardest labor commandos with the explicit understanding that they were not expected to survive. The final offering of the document was conducted with theatrical cruelty designed to break even the strongest resistance. Witnesses were assembled in the camp square on a freezing January morning in 1945, just weeks before the Soviet liberation. An SS officer stood before them with a stack of declaration forms and delivered what witnesses later described as a speech of devastating logic. He reminded them that Germany was losing the war, that the camps would soon be evacuated or liberated, that their suffering had been meaningless because the Reich they refused to serve was already dead. He told them their families had likely perished in other camps, their children had forgotten them, their congregations back home had moved on without them. He explained that their faith had accomplished nothing except their own destruction, and that God, if he existed at all, had clearly abandoned them to this frozen hell. Then he made his final offer: sign now, not for Hitler who would soon be gone, but for yourselves, for the chance to survive the next few weeks and see freedom when it comes. This is not about loyalty to the Reich anymore, he said. This is about choosing life over pointless death. The speech was designed to exploit the one crack in witness theology that the Nazis had finally identified. If the war was ending and the Nazi regime was collapsing, then their refusal to sign was no longer protecting God's kingdom from earthly governments. It was simply choosing to die for a government that no longer mattered. The logic was seductive, and several witnesses, weakened by years of starvation and torture, stepped forward to sign. But the vast majority remained motionless, and their silence enraged the SS officer beyond measure. He screamed that they were fools, that they were choosing death over life for absolutely nothing, that their stubbornness was proof of insanity rather than faith. Then he gave the order that condemned dozens of purple triangles to their final torment. They were to be sent to the Monowitz labor camp, a sub-camp of Auschwitz, where prisoners worked in the synthetic rubber factory under conditions so brutal that average survival time was measured in weeks rather than months. Monowitz was hell within hell, a place where the machinery of industrial production merged seamlessly with the machinery of death. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in freezing temperatures, hauling massive bags of chemicals, operating dangerous equipment without training or safety measures, and breathing toxic fumes that burned their lungs and corroded their throats. The capos who supervised the work details were selected specifically for their cruelty, and they beat prisoners who slowed down, beat them for working too fast, beat them for looking up or looking down, or for any reason or no reason at all. Food rations at Buna were even smaller than in the main camp, barely enough to sustain a resting body, let alone one performing hard labor. Prisoners collapsed regularly, and those who fell were dragged to the side and left to die or shot if they tried to return to the barracks. The purple triangles sent to Buna understood immediately that this was their death sentence, delivered not through gas chambers but through systematic work until their bodies simply gave out. Yet even here, in this final degradation, the witnesses maintained their identity and their faith in ways that astonished even hardened prisoners who thought they had seen everything Auschwitz could produce. They continued to refuse lying and stealing, even when both would have increased their survival chances. They shared their starvation rations equally, rather than hoarding food like other prisoners. When one witness collapsed from exhaustion, others would try to carry him and his work burden, risking their own lives to protect a brother in faith. They sang hymns in whispers during the march back to barracks, maintaining their worship even as their bodies disintegrated. Other prisoners at Buna, watching this, experienced a strange cognitive dissonance. These people were dying, clearly and inevitably, yet they seemed to possess something that the survivors around them had lost. They were not surviving, but they also were not broken. They were dying on their own terms for their own reasons, and that defiance carried a power that brute force could not extinguish. The SS guards at Buna noticed this as well, and it filled them with a fury that transcended rational military discipline. In the final weeks before the camp's evacuation in January 1945, guards began selecting purple triangles for special abuse that went beyond even the standard horrific treatment. They were forced to stand at attention in sub-zero temperatures for hours, while other prisoners were allowed to rest. They were beaten more frequently and more severely than other prisoners for identical infractions. Some were subjected to mock executions where they were lined up against walls, told they would be shot, and then laughed at when the guards fired blanks or simply walked away. The cruelty had transcended any practical purpose and become purely symbolic. These prisoners had to be broken, not because it served any military or ideological goal, but because their continued resistance represented an intolerable challenge to everything the camp system stood for. They had to be proven wrong. Their faith had to be revealed as delusion, or else everything the Nazis had built in Auschwitz was threatened by the existence of people who would not submit. On January 18, 1945, with Soviet artillery audible in the distance, the SS gave the order to evacuate Auschwitz and its subcamps. What followed became known as the Death Marches, and for the purple triangles still alive in Monowitz, it represented the final test of endurance that would determine whether their years of resistance had any meaning beyond martyrdom. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were forced to march westward through the frozen Polish countryside in the middle of winter, wearing only their thin striped uniforms and whatever scraps of clothing they had managed to acquire. Those who fell behind were shot immediately by SS guards who walked alongside the columns with orders to leave no witnesses to what had happened in the camps. The march covered over 60 kilometers through snow and ice, with no food provided and only occasional handfuls of snow for water. Thousands died in the first 24 hours alone, their bodies left in ditches along the road like discarded refuse. The witnesses who survived the initial days of the march did so through a combination of physical resilience, built from years of hard labor, and the same communal support system that had sustained them throughout their imprisonment. They walked in small groups when possible, supporting each other physically when someone stumbled, sharing body heat at night when the columns stopped in open fields, and maintaining whispered encouragement that kept spirits alive even as bodies failed. Other prisoners noticed that purple triangles seemed to die at slightly lower rates than the general population during these marches, not because they were stronger physically, but because they refused to give up on each other. When a witness fell, other witnesses would try to lift him, sometimes carrying a semi-conscious brother for kilometers before their own strength gave out. This solidarity occasionally inspired prisoners from other groups to help as well, creating temporary bonds of humanity in circumstances designed to reduce everyone to pure animal survival instinct. But the march also revealed the absolute limits of faith and endurance in the face of physiological reality. No amount of belief could compensate for months or years of starvation, disease, and brutal labor. The human body has finite reserves, and the witnesses had depleted theirs long ago, surviving on sheer determination and mutual support when biological science said they should already be dead. On the death marches, that determination finally met conditions it could not overcome. Witnesses began to fall despite the efforts of their brothers to hold them up. Some collapsed mid-step and never rose again. Others sat down in the snow, whispered prayers, and waited for the bullet they knew was coming. A few, their minds finally breaking under the accumulated trauma of years, began to hallucinate, seeing visions of paradise or hearing voices of dead loved ones calling them home. The SS guards shot them all indiscriminately, making no distinction between the purple triangles and any other prisoner who could not maintain the pace. Those witnesses who survived the march arrived at camps deeper in Germany, places like Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, where conditions were somehow even worse than Auschwitz because the infrastructure had completely collapsed under the weight of evacuated prisoners from the east. There was no food, no medicine, no sanitation, and barely any shelter. Typhus swept through the camps in waves, killing hundreds daily. The dead were piled in enormous heaps because there was no capacity to bury or burn them anymore. The SS guards had largely abandoned their posts, leaving the camps to descend into complete chaos, where the strong stole from the weak and every person fought desperately for another day of life. In this environment, the witness community structure finally began to fracture under pressures that exceeded anything Auschwitz had produced. They had no extra food to share because there was no food at all. They could not maintain cleanliness because there was no water and no strength left to clean anything. Some witnesses, faced with the choice between watching their brothers starve or stealing food from other prisoners, chose survival for the first time in years. Yet even in this collapse, even as their bodies betrayed them and their community splintered, the vast majority of purple triangles who had survived this far did not sign the document that still, incredibly, remained available to them. Camp administrators in these final weeks of the war, operating in bureaucratic autopilot, even as the Reich crumbled around them, continued to keep the declarations on file and occasionally offered them to witnesses they encountered. The offers were made almost mechanically now, without the speeches or psychological warfare of earlier years, simply presenting the paper and asking if they wanted to sign. Almost none did. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, and seen too many of their brothers die faithful to consider abandoning everything in the final hours. Their refusal was no longer about logic or even conscious choice. It had become reflexive, a core identity forged in the fires of Auschwitz that could not be unmade even by the complete dissolution of the world around them. The liberation came in April and May of 1945, as British and American forces overran the camps and discovered the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Soldiers found walking skeletons, mass graves, and survivors so damaged physically and psychologically that many could barely comprehend that they were finally free. Among these survivors were purple triangles, fewer than half of those who had entered the camp system, but still alive, still identifiable by their badges, still refusing to sign even when presented with the document by well-meaning Allied officers who thought it might be necessary for their release. The war was over, Hitler was dead, the Reich had fallen, and the Jehovah's Witnesses had endured through it all without betraying their faith. But the cost of that victory was about to become clear in ways that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Liberation brought freedom, but not relief, and for the purple triangles who survived, the aftermath of Auschwitz proved almost as traumatic as the camps themselves. Allied soldiers and relief workers, confronted with the unimaginable horror of the concentration camps, struggled to process what they were witnessing and often failed to understand the unique nature of the witness prisoners. Medical personnel focused on treating the most obviously sick and injured, which meant the witnesses, who had maintained better hygiene and health disciplines than many other prisoners, were sometimes overlooked in the initial triage. When survivors were asked to identify themselves and explain why they had been imprisoned, the purple triangles faced disbelief and sometimes hostility from liberators who could not comprehend why anyone would choose to stay in a concentration camp for religious reasons. Some Allied officers, learning that these prisoners could have signed a document and walked free at any time, expressed anger rather than sympathy, viewing their suffering as self-inflicted and therefore less worthy of assistance than that of Jews or political prisoners who had no such option. The return home proved devastating in ways the camps had not prepared them for, because the witnesses had survived by focusing entirely on spiritual endurance rather than processing the emotional and psychological trauma accumulating within them. Those who returned to Germany found their homes occupied by strangers, their possessions looted or destroyed, their kingdom halls burned or converted to other uses. Many discovered that their families had not survived the war, with spouses dead in other camps, children lost in the chaos of bombing and evacuation, parents perished from starvation or disease in the ghettos and prisons. The faith that had sustained them through Auschwitz now provided cold comfort as they stood in the ruins of their former lives, realizing that their sacrifice had saved their souls but cost them everything earthly they had ever loved. Some experienced profound spiritual crises, not doubting their beliefs but struggling to understand why God had allowed such complete destruction. Others threw themselves into rebuilding their religious community with manic intensity, needing the structure and purpose to avoid confronting the grief that threatened to consume them. The psychological aftermath manifested in patterns that modern trauma specialists would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1945 no such diagnosis existed and no treatment was offered. Survivors experienced nightmares that recreated the camps with hallucinatory intensity, waking screaming in the middle of the night, convinced they were back in Auschwitz. They hoarded food compulsively, unable to throw away even moldy bread because years of starvation had rewired their relationship with sustenance. They startled at loud noises, flinched from raised hands, and struggled with basic social interactions because the skills required for normal human relationships had atrophied during years of living under constant threat. Many could not speak about their experiences at all, even to fellow survivors, because putting the horror into words made it too real and threatened the fragile psychological barriers they had constructed to remain functional. The witness community encouraged them to focus on the future and on spiritual matters, which helped some but left others isolated with trauma they could not process or express. The children who had been taken from witness parents and raised in Nazi orphanages or foster homes presented heartbreaking reunification challenges that highlighted the full human cost of the Purple Triangle's resistance. Some children, returned to their surviving parents after the war, had no memory of them and had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, creating situations where parents who had suffered years in camps to maintain their faith now faced offspring who had been taught to despise everything their parents believed. Others had been so young when separated that they could not remember their original names or families, making reunification impossible even when both parents and children had survived. A few, having been told their parents were dead, had grieved and moved on, and the sudden reappearance of a skeletal stranger claiming to be their mother or father produced psychological trauma rather than joy. These reunifications sometimes succeeded, with patience and time rebuilding bonds that had been severed, but others failed completely, leaving parents who had sacrificed everything for their faith to discover that their children were lost to them more completely than if they had died. The broader society showed little interest in the witness story and sometimes active hostility toward their claims of persecution. In the immediate post-war period, attention focused overwhelmingly on Jewish victims of the Holocaust, which was appropriate given the scale and nature of the genocide, but left other victim groups marginalized in historical memory and compensation efforts. When witnesses sought recognition as victims of Nazi persecution, they encountered skepticism from officials who viewed their imprisonment as consequence of their own choices rather than racial or political persecution. Some survivors were denied reparations because authorities determined they could have avoided imprisonment by simply complying with military service requirements, ignoring the fact that such compliance would have violated the core religious beliefs for which they had been imprisoned in the first place. This bureaucratic cruelty compounded their suffering, sending the message that their sacrifice had been foolish rather than heroic, meaningless rather than meaningful. Yet despite all of this, despite the trauma and loss and societal indifference, the surviving Purple Triangles largely maintained their faith and rebuilt their religious community with determination that mirrored their resistance in the camps. They gathered in makeshift kingdom halls, printed new literature to replace what had been destroyed, and resumed the preaching work that had brought them into conflict with the Nazis in the first place. They did not seek fame or recognition, did not write memoirs demanding the world acknowledge their suffering, and did not allow their experience to embitter them against humanity despite having witnessed its absolute worst manifestations. They simply continued living according to their beliefs, caring for each other, and trying to find meaning in survival. The question that haunted many of them, spoken quietly in private moments, was whether that meaning existed at all, or whether they had simply endured hell for no reason that would ever be understood by anyone who had not been there. Today, more than 80 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, the story of the Purple Triangles remains one of the least known chapters of the Holocaust, overshadowed by the vastly larger tragedy of the Jewish genocide and largely absent from mainstream historical education. Most Americans have never heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who chose imprisonment over compromise, never learned about the document they refused to sign, and never considered what it means that thousands of ordinary people endured years of torture for a belief that most of the world viewed as insignificant. This historical amnesia is not accidental. The witness story complicates the narrative of World War II in uncomfortable ways, raising questions about the nature of resistance, the limits of conscience, and whether choosing martyrdom over survival constitutes heroism or fanaticism. It forces us to confront the reality that people died for reasons we might not understand or agree with, and that their sacrifice deserves recognition regardless of whether we share their beliefs. The legacy of the Purple Triangles exists primarily within the Jehovah's Witness community itself, where survivor testimonies have been preserved, documented, and shared as evidence of faith's power to endure even the darkest evil. Kingdom halls around the world display photographs of concentration camp survivors wearing their purple triangles, and the symbol has become an emblem of religious resistance that carries profound meaning for modern witnesses facing persecution in countries like Russia, Eritrea, and China. The historical experience of Auschwitz informs contemporary witness theology about suffering, endurance, and the cost of maintaining integrity in an hostile world. But outside this community, the story has faded into obscurity, mentioned briefly in comprehensive Holocaust histories if at all, and rarely taught in schools or commemorated in museums. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington includes exhibits on various victim groups, but the witnesses receive minimal attention compared to other categories of persecution. This erasure from collective memory reveals uncomfortable truths about how societies choose which suffering to remember and which to forget. The Purple Triangles challenge our understanding of victimhood because they were victims who could have stopped being victims at any moment, simply by changing their minds. This agency makes their suffering seem less tragic to many people, as if the ability to escape somehow diminishes the horror of what they endured. But this reasoning ignores the fundamental reality that forcing someone to choose between their deepest beliefs and their physical survival is itself a form of torture, and that the courage required to maintain conviction in the face of death deserves recognition regardless of whether we would make the same choice. The witnesses in Auschwitz were not dying for nothing. They were dying for something we may not value, but which they valued more than life itself, and that deserves to be remembered even if we cannot fully understand it. The final legacy of the Purple Triangles lies in what their story reveals about human nature at its extremes, both its darkness and its light. The Nazis who tormented them demonstrated how ideology can transform ordinary people into architects of systematic cruelty, using psychological warfare and emotional manipulation with the same cold efficiency they applied to industrial murder. But the witnesses who resisted demonstrated something equally important: that human beings possess reserves of strength that exceed what biology or psychology suggests should be possible, that community and belief can sustain life when all material support has been stripped away, and that some people will choose principles over survival even when doing so appears completely irrational. Both realities are part of the Auschwitz story, and both need to be remembered if we are to understand what human beings are truly capable of when pushed to absolute limits. The question the Purple Triangles leave us with is not whether their faith was right or wrong, whether their sacrifice was heroic or foolish, whether they should be celebrated or pitied. The question is simpler and more profound. In a world that demanded they betray everything they believed or die, they chose to die, and we forgot they ever existed. What does it say about us that we have allowed this story to vanish? What does it say about our values that we struggle to honor sacrifice made for reasons we do not share? And what does it say about history itself, that some suffering is deemed worthy of remembrance while other suffering disappears into silence? The Purple Triangles cannot answer these questions. They are gone, along with their brothers and sisters who died in the camps, and the children they never saw again, and the families that were destroyed. But their story remains, waiting in the archives and the fading memories of the last survivors, a testament to faith and suffering that the world chose not to see, until now.